Okay, so that was a short and sweet introduction. Firstly, thank you very much for having me down today, and I think I can see a couple of familiar faces in the audience because I spoke at one of the events a year ago about social media to wealth managers then. For those of you who didn't attend that event, which I'm sure there's a lot of you here that didn't, I'll just give a little bit of an introduction about my background and what I do at the moment and my sort of experience and involvement with social media. So I'm the private client director at Digitalis Reputation, which is an online reputation management company. And looking after the private clients, I head up that department, and the private clients typically include high net worth individuals, business leaders, celebrities, and people with a personal reputation issue online, but it also does span out more to the corporate environment as well. Now, previous to that, I was actually a social media consultant, and I started in that area. If we sort of rewind, about, 8 years or so now, I was doing a PhD in social informatics at University College Dublin. Now, at the time, social media was a really new area, so it was very exciting to be involved in it, and it's still very exciting now because it's obviously quite progressive, moves very quickly. So I was researching for about 4 years all the new types of media that were evolving, how it's changing the way that we communicate, and how technology is changing media and social engagement. So I then wanted to move away from academia and come more into sort of a corporate environment because I noticed that there was this huge divide, largely between the research that I was doing and actually practice. How people were implementing communication strategies and policies within a company. And also, to be frank, quite a big generational gap was developing, and that still exists now. Because obviously, there's a lot of people that grew up with Twitter, iPhones, well now they're growing up with iPhones, I suppose, that's not still quite new, and all these modern ways of communicating, which was very different and also challenging for people using traditional communication methods to understand the importance, and also to be able to use them in their organisations. So as a social media consultant, I was advising some consumer-based clients largely on how they could make the most of social media and bring it into their broader communication strategies. And then I moved on to online reputation management, which is quite a new area again. We've got all this information out there, and now people are really worried about what they should be putting out there, managing it, their privacy, etc. But I'll come on to that a little bit later. So what I want to do today is just talk largely, I suppose, about Twitter, because that's what the title of the discussion is, but not just exclusively about Twitter. I'm going to cover a few of the other tools that are quite useful for people to use and hopefully for you to use and understand a little bit better. I don't want to bore you to death with stats, because I think everyone sitting here knows how many people are on Twitter, how many people are on Facebook, how important it is. You're probably sick to death of hearing, that we should all be tweeting and Instagramming and this is the way forward. But I suppose the general message is that yes, that is true. It is a new form of communication, and it's not going to go away, and it's only going to stay around, and it is becoming more and more important for a business perspective as well as social perspective. So to tweet or not to tweet, I think is quite an interesting title for today, especially in light of what happened with British Gas only last week or a couple of weeks ago. Some of you may have seen this story in the news, how their social media manager thought that it would be a good idea to start a conversation about the increase in energy prices, which was a little bit of a social media faux pas, because while they wanted to appear approachable and easily accessible, it was extremely bad timing when there was heightened emotions and a lot of angry consumers out there. And as a result, their Twitter feed was flooded with abusive messages, and it became a scandal that was reported across the board in most of the national newspapers and ended up being quite a negative use of social media. So Twitter sort of crops up, I think, quite often in crisis situations, and it doesn't always have to go wrong. You know, that was probably an example of somebody not really thinking through their strategy, not analysing the mood, probably not really communicating effectively the message that they were hoping to get across. And whilst it's great to engage with people, you know, there is a risk factor with social media, and that's something that's very important to keep in mind. You are opening yourself up to potentially criticism, and it's a situation where if you're not prepared to shout something at the top of your voice at Oxford Circus, then don't put it on Twitter, and perhaps don't bait such controversy. But then there's, you know, the stories of DKNY, which is the fashion brand largely known really for producing jeans. They were doing a big fashion shoot a few years ago, or they were doing a commercial campaign. And there was an argument on Twitter that erupted about the fact they'd used an image that they hadn't had the rights signed off properly. And it sort of gathered momentum. More and more people were complaining, retweeting. Bad news was spreading quite quickly. Now, how they dealt with it was very reactive. And the DKNY PR girl, it was actually led by one single person who became the voice of that company. On social media, and you know, they apologized, they said they're very sorry, they held their hands up, and they answered as many questions as they possibly could, and actually it was dealt with very, very effectively. And she was gave it almost a personal approach in the crisis situation, and has subsequently, I think, signed a book deal only quite recently to leave DKNY because she did such a good job. So, as I said, largely the difference between those two stories is, you know, really how reactive you are in a situation. And I don't think if you're talking about crisis news, you know, there does have to be a very carefully thought out strategy about how you're approaching things. And that follows through with Twitter generally. So what is the core of Twitter? I mean, it's a real-time information network. I don't know how many people in this room have a Twitter account or have used a Twitter account. Okay. How many people sort of would understand what its purpose is? Yeah, even if you don't have an account, you sort of understand. Well, for those of you that don't, very, you know, short and sweetly, it's a real-time information network. It was initially designed as a social network to connect people and encourage engagement, but also allows you to share stories. And I think what's key to the Twitter model is that people can follow certain individuals, certain companies, and they've automatically got a live news feed, you know, coming through to their Twitter account. So if you're following, I don't know, BBC News, The Telegraph, The Guardian, The Daily Mail, Sky News, you can follow all of their updates. And the first thing you can do when you wake up in the morning is check your Twitter account on your phone, and you know exactly what's going on. You know, news doesn't break anywhere quicker now than it does on Twitter. So, and I think Twitter in particular, whilst it was originally started as a social network, it is becoming more and more about news. And I'm actually working in a project at the moment with the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford, which is looking at how social media and traditional media are interacting. And that's certainly key with Twitter. You know, users are wanting to be updated on what's going on. They want constructive information to be fed to them. So if you're thinking about a social media strategy for your company, or if you want to use it in a personal account, you almost have to put yourself in the position as, well, what would you want to read? You know, what would you find interesting? And then base your model and your content model on putting suitable tweets out. So it sort of leads on to how can you make Twitter work? And I think it does need to be quite clearly thought out with regards to sort of the key things that you're looking at. It's, you know, you're focusing on the speed of information, so how quickly you're reacting to news, what you're putting out there, you know, how relevant it is for people. You know, do people want to know what this news is about? Also, are you sharing people's tweets? Have you seen an article on the BBC News that you think would be really interesting? Retweet it so your followers can tweet it. Maybe add your own opinion into it as well, rather than just get into that trap of retweeting endless news updates. You know, I think the way to stand out in the Twitter sphere is to also have an individual identity or a corporate identity. Now, you'll notice I almost split the two, because I think it is quite difficult to have to be tweeting in a personal and professional capacity, and I think you almost need to make a decision as to which way you're going. You know, largely because I think if you're tweeting as an individual, you have to think, you know, what are you going to tweet about? Are you going to tweet about your work, your professional life? Are you going to tweet about gardening? Are you going to tweet about football? Are you going to tweet about rugby? You know, all of this will attract people to follow you. But what are the sort of people that you're wanting to follow you? What's the purpose of using Twitter? Whereas if it's for on behalf of, you know, a company or a body, you have a very clear direction as to what your ideal user base is, and therefore you can target tweets accordingly. Now, if you are wanting to tweet as an individual, you know, there is an opportunity to become an authority on Twitter. And as I said before, there's not only people are wanting to follow you because they find your views interesting on certain topics, or they find the content that you're sharing interesting, but there's also potentially journalists out there who are looking for news stories. And that's something to keep in mind, that whenever you're tweeting as an individual, that if you are purposefully going out there to be controversial, then you need to, you know, expect that your quotes could be used if there was a news article about a certain topic. So it relates to that sort of awareness that what you're saying, that you are held accountable for that. And the same goes, you know, for if you are tweeting on behalf of, you know, an organisation. Now, if you're using it for your company, your organisation, your board, whatever it may be, I think that social media strategy needs to be, not only does the content need to be thought out, but the risks need to be assessed, and how it's managed is also quite important. So we had an incident with I think it was the Red Cross actually, only a couple of years ago. It was reported that somebody from the Red Cross updated their Twitter feed when they were out, basically saying, you know, getting drunk, having a great night with my friends, and that came out on the Red Cross Twitter feed. Now, what happened there was the person was probably signed into 2 accounts on their iPhone. They probably were a little bit tipsy and didn't realise who they were actually tweeting as. And mistakes like that can happen quite easily, and the consequences, depending on what the material is that's posted, can be quite serious. So if you are looking at deploying a strategy, a Twitter strategy within a company, there certainly needs to be somebody who takes responsibility for it, and measures need to be sort of taken to make sure that account is as secure as possible and mistakes like that don't necessarily happen. So there are lots of different social media channels, and like I said, Twitter really is only one of them. I mean, they are, not only are they growing, Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn are probably the 3 key ones that have been established for a while now, and they are still there. I mean, I'm relatively skeptical about how long Facebook will survive, but certainly Twitter and LinkedIn are serving, you know, a fundamental purpose, whether it's as a news channel, which I think Twitter is leaning more towards, or as a professional networking service, which is of LinkedIn. You know, I can see those really surviving very strongly. Facebook is different, and I don't think it's overly relevant for what we're talking about today, because it's very much a social network, and that is their model. You know, it's signing in to get an update on your friends, or looking at your, you know, new babies, weddings, you know, your cousins that are living in Australia, whatever it may be. It's very much a recreational network. The 2 that are more applicable to the professional environment are certainly Twitter in its ability to release news statements, important content that maybe is driving traffic to your website, create an authoritative following, and then LinkedIn for a slightly more closed approach, where you can share news around, you can join various groups, you can have your CV, you can use it for recruitment opportunities. You know, they're sort of the key aspects of those 2 networks. And then, you know, we have something like Instagram, which people are talking about all the time now. Now, Instagram, again, you know, it's great for some markets, but it's not necessarily going to be relevant for what you're doing. And that's important when you're looking at social media. It's to select the channels that are relevant to what you're doing and what you can make relevant as well to your company. You know, I would say there's hardly any point having an Instagram unless you're involved more in a consumer sort of, you know, beauty industry, fashion, you're trying to sell products, maybe photography. You know, it's very much based around that. Now, during, as I mentioned earlier, I'm doing this research project at the moment, and it's really interesting speaking to a lot of the leading financial PRs like Brunswick and Finsbury and their sort of views on on social media. And they, again, support the view that Twitter is very important, but that also social media is part of now a communication strategy. And I almost don't like to single it out and have it isolated, because at the end of the day, it's how we communicate, and it's all linked to this change in behaviour, which may not be totally relevant now, but in 20, 30 years' time, when we've seen this full transition go through, that is the way that, you know, people are going to be communicating, not just socially, but in the business context as well. And it is a matter of a changing generation to a certain extent. Now, there could be people that you are working with that are, you know, junior in the company, but they actually know an awful lot about social media. So when it comes to this new form of communication, I think it's important for companies to try and make the most of that knowledge. And obviously, as a senior role, you're sort of going to be looking for the risks, and you're going to be more responsible for the output and, you know, the tone of voice. But there is an opportunity there to really make the most of people that are coming up through organisations, you know, who are maybe in a junior role, and they don't know everything about, you know, what they're supposed to be doing 9 to 5 as such, but they know an awful lot about social media, and that can, I think, come in quite useful when you're brainstorming and when you're implementing communication strategies. So, social media is not for everyone. And I understand that, and I don't think that I should sit here and say to you, everybody should be on social media. You know, I think you have to see how you can use it, what the benefit is going to be, and how you implement it. But sort of to bring it back more to the broader online industry and where we're going, as I said, I sort of work largely in the reputation area at the moment, but it's still sort of quite, you know, general online issues. And one big advantage of having social media accounts is that you do own those online assets. So I'm typically dealing a lot of the time with clients who will come in and say, I Google my name or I Google my company's name and I really don't like what I see. There's a bad news article or there's no internet presence there at all, whatever it may be. You know, they just don't like it and they think that they're missing a trick. And often, yes, they are. And one of those key tricks is having a social media presence, so that if you are Googling your company's name, hopefully you've got a really highly optimized website. It's ranking at the top of the page and multiple site listings, you know, with about sort of 6 pages, 6 short links coming underneath. And then maybe you've got your Twitter feed, and then you've got your LinkedIn, and then you've got a blog, and then maybe you've got a news article. So on that first page of Google, which is becoming more and more important now as people are Googling to find information out, there is a significant presence of the company. And that's where social media comes in useful for securing Twitter handles, having the biography in the, you know, the short biography at the top of the page, and owning that space and having it as a high-ranking asset. How often you tweet from it, I mean, yes, you can't have a completely dead Twitter account because it won't rank as highly for you, it won't work as well. But the pressure isn't necessarily to tweet all the time. And that's something as well, just to highlight, I'll sort of wrap it up now really, but just to highlight is some people do fall into the trap of over-tweeting, or, you know, we should be on Twitter because we feel like we have to be on Twitter, everyone's on Twitter. You know, that's not the case. Yes, I think you need to make the most of the right social media tools, but what you're saying has got to be interesting, informative, directing traffic to your website, and with the right tone of voice to really sort of make the most of it. So that's pretty much everything that I was going to cover for now.
Excellent.
But, you know.
Thank you, Laura. That's great. Well, my name's Dan O'Hara, and I work on social media for the CISI. So what I'm going to do is quickly take you through some of the things that we're doing to try and use social media to communicate with our audiences, to communicate with our members, to communicate with all of you, and take you through some of the broader things that we think social media can do for us, and also the ways that you can get involved via social media. So I know Laura said she wasn't going to give you statistics, but I'm afraid I
Sorry.
am going to give you a few, unfortunately. So really, I could just leave it at that and let you sit in awe of those stats, but I'll talk a bit about what we're doing to basically try and get involved in that and use some of those sort of numbers to hit our audience and how we're doing that. So where are we? Well, at the moment, essentially we're growing strongly across social media channels. We've been quite focused in our communications because obviously, like Laura said, there's not not everyone on social media is necessarily the right audience, and you don't want to be communicating with everyone just because they're there. We want to be focusing our communications and focusing on the audiences that matter. So what we've been doing is using Twitter and growing, as you can see on that graph, and the statistics there. Strong growth month on month, and that number of followers, 1,400, is actually slightly outdated. I looked earlier today and we're at 1,538, I think. So again, you can see we keep growing as an organisation that's communicating via Twitter and, like Laura said as well, communicating the news and the information. So what we're actually giving to that audience, I'll come on to in a bit. But essentially, those are good numbers. Similarly, on LinkedIn, you can see the number of group members there are around 5,500. Again, these statistics are from around a month ago. We've grown since then. And you can also see, interestingly, one of the benefits of LinkedIn as a business and networking tool is that we've got statistics on the areas that people work in, the regions that they work, and their position within businesses. So again, you can see how it's a really, really interesting tool for segmenting your audience and making sure that the communications that you're giving to them, for instance, if we know that 28% of our audience on LinkedIn are senior within their organisations, we know that our communications, we don't want to be putting out communications at a really junior level. So it's information like that which does make, well, social media generally, but particularly a tool like LinkedIn, a really useful communications platform. So that's where we are. What are we doing? Well, basically, boiled down to its most basic level, we're doing three things. Firstly, we're disseminating messages. So as an organisation that's founded on basically information about the financial services industry, we're sharing a lot of that industry insight and information with our audiences. So that's both with our members and with non-members as well, who choose to follow us because we're seen as a voice on those sort of topics. Secondly, we're spreading messages of knowledge, expertise and integrity. So it's the same idea. It's all those core values that we hold at the CISI, and it's spreading those to the audiences that we can reach through mediums like Twitter and LinkedIn. And as well as that, we're letting members know about the benefits available to them. So that's where social media is a really useful tool, because as opposed to simply bombarding you with emails about things that are going on and the benefits that you have as members, we can use those social media channels to maybe make it a bit more of a conversation around those benefits and have people responding, and I'll come on to that there. So the second thing we're doing is engaging members. So when we talk to our members about our benefits, they can talk back to us. It's not a one-way mass marketing channel, it's a communication stream. So both members and non-members are getting involved in online conversations on LinkedIn and Twitter. That's fantastic for us as an organisation, and it's good for our members as well, because they can take part, they can feel more involved in us as an organisation. As well as that, key events are generating conversations on social media. So two of our bigger events, our annual conference earlier in the year, and our training and competence conference recently, we developed conference-specific hashtags which allowed communication channel to run throughout the event, and got speakers involved, got the delegates involved, and you have a conversation running in parallel to the actual event. You have a sort of online event going on next to the event in person. So even at our annual integrity debate, we did the same thing, and any questions as well that weren't able to be asked during the actual event, we got them tweeted in. So I mean, it's expanding that conversation beyond what would be possible simply in the sort of physical space. And then the third thing we're doing is sort of related to the engagement, but is generating interaction. So it's encouraging our members on LinkedIn and on Twitter to, if they find the information that we're sharing useful, to retweet. Like Laura said, like if they find it interesting, they can share it with their followers by retweeting. If we've put an interesting article together, or if there's an interesting grey matters on integrity, they can share that content with their followers and spread our messages wider, basically. As well as that, they mention us. So on Twitter particularly, when people are taking our qualifications or are attending our events, by using our Twitter handle at CISI, which I'd encourage you all to use, they can discuss us, and then, if possible, we'll get involved in that conversation. And basically, the theme here is making a conversation more than just making it into a conversation. So it's more than just a one-way stream of communications coming from us. It makes us more interactive as a membership organisation, which is what we're supposed to be. This is what we do. We don't just talk at our members, we talk with our members. So social media is basically providing another space in which we can do that. So I mean, I've already been through some of this. How are we doing this? So we're sharing content. Essentially, one of the mantras, I mean, runs across outside social media, but content is king, is sort of oft-repeated mantra. So what we're doing is sharing valuable content. So whether that's videos, potentially like the one being filmed today, or whether that's interesting articles or reports that both our members and non-members will find interesting. So it's positioning ourselves as an authority through the great content that we share. We're also starting discussions. I mentioned grey matters. These integrity scenarios that we come up with are the sort of thing that you don't just want someone to read it and think about it to themselves. You want someone to read it and come back with their comments and say, I disagree with this. I think the position on a response that fits with integrity would be to choose this option. So there are things that we do where it's really great to be able to have those discussions and start conversations even if people don't always agree with each other. And then thirdly, giving industry updates. So like I said, we've got a raft of expertise amongst yourselves in particular, sort of linked to the organisation. So it's sharing some of that expertise and providing social media provides a great media to do that. So like I said, I mean, just a few examples of some of the ways that members are starting the discussion themselves without us even having to go out there and get them, simply by having a presence, as Laura said, sort of owning that space. We own our Twitter handles, so by owning that, members can then communicate with us. Instead of, for instance, if you look at John Walker's tweet there, instead of just tweeting just in the process of organising and just writing CISI, he can tweet at us and it gets us involved, it notifies us that he's talking about us, and it allows us to talk back and communicate. And with qualifications as well, you see the sort of the pride that people attach to the qualifications they get from us, and they want to be able to share that, and social media provides a great opportunity to do that. So like I said, this is what promotes engagement. This is how we get people involved. It's interesting news stories, it's sharing the knowledge and advice, it's discussing their qualifications, the pride that they have in those, and where those qualifications are taking them. And it's events. things like this one, which has the hashtag COSICPD, if you want to get involved on Twitter. Or things like our annual conference, or like our major conferences, as I mentioned. So I suppose the interesting thing for you then is how can you get involved with what we're doing? You can do a whole raft of things, but specifically following us on Twitter, and not just following us, as it says up there, getting involved in the conversations. So when we post something, again, like I said, if you disagree with something we post up, let us know. We can have those conversations. They're not ones that we necessarily want hidden away, and I think that's often the mistake of brands on social media, is to neglect to have any conversations that are anything other than purely positive. It's okay sometimes to have those conversations out there and create that interaction. And you can see updates on our upcoming events, essentially. Again, it's another way to find out about all the ways that you can interact with the CISI. And accessing the latest industry information, as I said. In terms of LinkedIn, again, it's like I used the analogy earlier about our conversations on Twitter for our conference being a sort of parallel, an online parallel to the conversations going on in real time at the actual event. LinkedIn is very much, it's a parallel to the networking that you do every day in real life at these sort of events. You can network, but in an online space through LinkedIn, so you connect with our other members like you would do at our events. You can take advantage of our specialist subgroups, so later on I think some of my colleagues can show you some of the subgroups that we have, particularly for the forums. And you can network with people specifically related to the industry you're in, or specifically related to the region that you're in. We have subgroups for that. So it's about, you can make it as big as you want to, or as sort of refined and small as you want to. There's the space to go out there and share as much content you want, interact with us as much as you want, and really get involved. Or if you're, would be perfectly understandable, slightly hesitant and would prefer to start smaller, there's the opportunity to do that too. Simply creating a Twitter account, following us, seeing if ever you're interested in some of the things that we post up, and using it as an information tool. And on LinkedIn, joining, as I presume, Laura did a hands thing, so I'm going to do a quick hands thing. I presume you're all on LinkedIn, quick show of hands? Yeah, so I mean, you're all already in that space, so through our subgroups, you can join with a sort of, I spoke to a member recently, he said he didn't like the idea of LinkedIn as everything all out there. It was too big a space, and I was trying to impress on him that through these sort of smaller groups, you can just connect with a few people and share a bit of information and keep up those relationships. So there's really an opportunity to do as much as you'd like on that. And that, fairly briefly, is what we're doing and how you can get involved with us. And now, I think we're happy to take any questions you might have.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions?
I do have a question. Just wait for the... Just wait.
Okay. Maybe I don't need the mic.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I was wondering, I'm a member of the Corporate Finance Forum Committee at CISI, and we do have a LinkedIn group, which we're not using much. And in fact, we're trying to figure how we can leverage that to promote some of the events we do. So maybe you have some specific tips for that. And also, can you integrate Twitter with LinkedIn? So maybe leverage Twitter as well to promote some of the things we do. And possibly how time consuming could that become? Because that's a risk that you might have to consider. Cheers.
It's probably best that you answer the LinkedIn one, but just on the point actually of merging social media, it's quite interesting because you do see users automatically link their accounts across the board, so that you know, they don't have to maintain a Facebook, a LinkedIn, and a Twitter account, and they can just do their updates via Twitter, and it automatically, you know, spreads the word to a wider network effectively. I think that it can be a useful tool, but it depends how often you're updating it, because there's a reason that LinkedIn is LinkedIn and Twitter is Twitter. So if you're a really active Twitter user and you're retweeting all the time and you're interacting with people, maybe your LinkedIn community don't really want to see all of your status updates feed through onto the LinkedIn channel. So that's just something to be wary of. But I mean, I believe you can still merge the two through LinkedIn and, you know, do an update. But there is a reason for LinkedIn, which, as I said, is more of a networking tool, and Twitter, which is really more of an information tool. But I think there's a great model here for anyone actually in this room who isn't using these technologies and would like to use them. You know, it's great that you've got an example that's pretty much, you know, relatively, you know, new and has grown significantly, and you've got a really engaged community. So it's almost like you can use this as your model. Yeah?
Yeah, thanks.
You can.
Yeah, on the first point, promoting things through LinkedIn, essentially I'd probably come back to my content is king phrase. Really, on social media, when you're looking to grow and engage people and get people interacting, the most important thing, I can't sort of impress it enough, is sharing things that people would be interested in. If you think about it, I mean, it's not rocket science essentially. Think about the websites that you use every day. What do you go on websites for? What gets you to click on things? Those sort of things are what you need to be using on social media to grow your own groups and get people involved. So if there's particular trends in corporate finance, or there's something in the news particularly related, if you've got something to say on that, or if there's an interesting article or something on that, then LinkedIn's the perfect forum to share that, and through that then that can be shared more and more people will engage. It's yeah, as I say, it's not I think social media doesn't need to be seen as a completely different space where the normal rules don't apply. I think as much as possible you can see it and sort of think, well, what's a normal website? What attracts me about a normal website? What do I click on there? Why would I go to a normal website? And apply those sort of rules to what you share in your corporate finance subgroup, then you will see that sort of growth. And it might not be an immediate process. I've worked on enough social media accounts to know it takes some time to build up. It takes some work. But if people start to see that you've got a steady stream of content coming through and they've got a reason to be there, basically, what's the benefit to them? Then you can you'll see that improvement.
What you need is a Gary Wright. On the IT forum and the operations forum, Gary Wright posts questions all the time. Some of the questions you think, why is he asking that? But others of them are things you think, yeah, he's absolutely on the money. And he's asking questions all the time on there. And as I say, so you that way, and they're big generic questions that anybody can chip into. So that is a really good way of getting people talking. As I say, he posts all the time on the forums that I see. Some of the questions are maddening, some of them are really interesting, and you often get really, so it's perhaps worth within the forum talking about the sort of questions that you can post up and just say to your members, what do you think about this? And it can be anything from things that are really specific to what you're doing at the moment to more general points about the industry as a whole.
Absolutely. That's completely the point, and that's something actually I've slightly neglected to say, which is the other side to sharing good content is asking good questions. That's the point. I mean, the kind of things, nothing starts a good conversation better than an interesting question. So, I mean, that's, again, the kind of thing that is going to grow your following and grow your interactions.
Can I just ask a broader question, which is probably about the future, as much probably directed at you, Laura, rather than the specifics of the CISI. The average age in the room is probably higher than yours. So the sort of evolution of business and speed of business has changed over the course of a lot of our life. You know, so some of us may have been writing letters. Some of us then moved on to the telephone. Email came in, started taking up a sort of inordinate amount of our time. Twitter and not so much LinkedIn, but Twitter, the sort of news and information exchange, which is driven at you rather than by you, if you like, How do you see that changing the shape of business, the proportion of time we spend on that, and is it going to become, as I suggest, possibly some of Gary's stuff is very useful, but you mentioned the word annoying, as all of it can be annoying. How's it going to change the shape of our business, our time that we put into it, and is it really adding value?
It's an interesting question, and actually, to be honest, I quite miss the days of writing letters. And believe it or not, I am actually old enough to have written a letter and put it in the post box rather than having to tweet everything. But and I do have this conversation quite often with my father. He's a lawyer, and he says, Laura, tell me about this LinkedIn, this Twitter. Do I really need it? And I try and explain. It's about putting news out there. It can be a good new business tool, engagement, interacting with people. He says, but I don't need any of that. If people want to instruct me, they instruct me, and that's that. I don't need it. And yes, there is that approach because, as I mentioned before, there is this big generational gap, which I've been sort of in that research space for a while. That does sort of drive the attitudes. And I think what we have to remember is that, yes, there is a new generation coming up, and this is a new way of communicating. But as I mentioned earlier, it's really the same way as we communicated previously. It's just almost taking on a different form. There are people tweeting. It's quicker, it's faster, it's more reactive. There's more risks associated with it. But it's still essentially about networking, which we've all been doing in a physical environment as well as online. And interacting and breaking news. It's just things are moving quicker. And what I find quite interesting about the space actually is that I think we are now getting to a time where there is a pullback on privacy. There is a concern, about what information is going out there, what information can be used as quotes actually legitimately in newspapers, the argument of the right to be forgotten, why if you put your name into Google do things, and that's something everyone in this room should do. I know it sounds a bit of an odd thing, but you should Google your name and you should Google your company name so you know what the landscape is and what the story is. And the reason I say that is because, there's a lot of people thinking, well, I don't want to Google my name, I'm not a big egotist, but the thing is that there are other people doing that, and that user behavior needs to be sort of recognized. You need to know what's out there about you and then monitor it and control it. It's dynamic where it's going. I think we are seeing a pullback towards privacy and hopefully maybe tighter legislations on communication, but I think we mustn't forget the underlying sort of rules of how we interact, and really there's not that much that's changed about that. It's just that it's online, so people shouldn't be frightened of it, shouldn't be concerned about it. They need to be aware of it and recognise that there's a lot of young people now who are all about Twitter, they're all about LinkedIn, they're all about Instagram, and that's where we're moving, and we don't want to make the gap any bigger, if that makes sense. So I suppose fundamentally, as I said before, we went through a phase where it's all about social media. It's not social media, it's communications and it's media, because we're going to get to a point where, yes, unfortunately, probably the broadsheet newspapers, won't be as readily available. Even now there's the decline in that side of things, and things are very technically geared. So again, it just becomes how we communicate rather than this new medium that we don't really understand. Does that answer it all?
I just wonder so do you think it'll displace some of the email channel, for instance, where you start off getting emails and now you get hundreds of emails a day, some of which are junk, some of which are seeking you, I think, as you made on your stuff. They're seeking you rather than you asking for them, which is where you want to put your filter on, and it's grown that time that you have to, get to the end of the day, and you've got to go through, and you've got to just process a whole lot of stuff which you possibly didn't have before, in case there's something useful in there. So do you think that'll change? Do you think Twitter will grow and it will become a predominant short communication channel at a group level rather than at a public?
Yes, I think that's why Twitter's been so successful. There's sort of quite a few different arguments around this, but the fact it's 149 characters for a tweet, it forces 140 characters. It forces you to be concise. And the other advantage of Twitter is it has become at times a one-way information channel, which I think people need to be aware of, which is why I mentioned earlier that LinkedIn is much more beneficial for actual networking. Twitter, it can be difficult to stand out from a crowd, and you can follow somebody, they don't necessarily have to follow you back. And that is almost why Twitter's successful, because it gives the user that barrier. So yes, as you say, people can tweet you, but you don't actually have to reply to them, if you don't want to. But I mean, it's been around for a long time now where, we work almost 24-hour days because there's so much information coming in and so many emails and people are more accessible. So yes, it does open up those channels, and that's something you have to be aware of, I think.
I think your point about time is interesting as well, because I think that's the big fear in terms of social media, especially Twitter, that it's non-stop. Like you said, 24-hour days. You could, if you wanted to, and you were sort of bizarrely inclined, you could spend your entire day working on social media, because there's enough information out there, there's enough conversations going on, that it could take up all of your time. So I'd probably come back to what you were saying earlier about figuring out why you want to be involved in social media. What are you getting out of it, essentially? And really coming back to that and focusing on how much time, even if you have to, I mean, in a business sense, I know I have to allot an amount of time during the day to social media because I can't afford to spend all my time on it. And on a personal sense, you can even do that too. You can say, I'm going to take in this much, or that you have to limit yourself, because it is, otherwise it is a bit of a behemoth, it's non-stop. So there are those sort of controls, and you've got to constantly be asking yourself, what am I getting out of this, basically?
Yeah, the value of it is really important, because, like you say, you could spend all day tweeting and getting more and more followers, and brilliant, but at the end of the day, how's that actually benefiting you? It's got to be, what you're putting out has got to be for the right reasons, largely maybe to direct traffic to your website, maybe it's new business initiatives, maybe it's to become more of authority in an area, and they should be your driving factors, not just being under pressure to tweet all the time and gather more followers, because yes, as you say, what's the point really?
I think if I can just pick up on a couple of things. I think first of all, looking at the work you do, Laura, on reputation. We've got a situation now whereby we've got to recognise the bulk of people who are looking at booking at hotels and so on from their own personal point of view will use the internet to get some opinion, which is very subjective around the quality of the hotel they may be choosing to go to. And there's one particular site which many people go to. Okay? So from that perspective, the hotels and so on need to be very cognizant of that. I think the rest of us also in our firms, we can look at the population of a firm. A firm that's got 50,000 people has probably got 20,000, 25,000, 30,000 who are in the age bracket which has grown up with social media as being the norm. And so from their point of view, they're looking and reading the reputations, the comments that are on there about the firm, what the firm's saying and doing, what others are saying about their firm as being something relative to their day job and the reputation they've got. So there are major factors. So firms are consistently now tracking and monitoring what's on Twitter. My boss, for example, every morning doesn't just look at the FT, doesn't just look at his BlackBerry, he looks at the Twitter account relative to the firm. Okay, it's in there. But I think that goes with the next bit, because when you opened up, Laura, you talked about thinking about whether you're doing something from a personal perspective or whether you're doing it from a business perspective. And the bit that I'd highlight here is there's actually no difference. If you're interviewing somebody, you'll Google and check. It doesn't matter that they may have made a comment on Facebook, they may have made a comment on Twitter, on their personal account. This is a statement about an individual which you're going to use for a judgment on whether they're someone you want to employ. If they're in your employment, you'll similarly may have something come to your attention which is nothing to do with business, but it's their statement out there, and it will actually contaminate the role in which someone's got. So I agree with you, you can have a personal and a business, but the second it's out there, imagine you can't scrub it, you can't erase it, somebody will find it. So I agree with the comments and the debate about Twitter and so on, and it's good to have debate, but have a debate, and it's a cultural change around something whereby your opinion may change, but what you said is something that you could stand by relative to the time in which you said it. And I think those two go well. I think the other thing is I'd say, and we had this earlier this year, we had the technology annual debate where we actually had Brunswick together with Goldman Sachs, together with a lawyer, together with a risk management chairman. And between the four, it's a really interesting combination of how Goldman's took on board bring your own device. How do you bring iPads into a Goldman's? What their approach was. What the approach was from the lawyer's perspective. You had the situation of somebody, a young teenager who had got themselves quite an influential position as, I think it wasn't a police commissioner, but it was one of the local police supervisors who gave up their job, gave up that position because of what they'd said 2 or 3 years earlier as a underworking age. You've got to be careful, but I still think you're exactly right. We've got to embrace it, but we've got to actually embrace it for what it is, rather than the damaging side. And then the positives will really flow. And as for the type of things you talk about from a LinkedIn perspective, I think the great thing about asking a question is that you ask it once, not that you put it on every single subgroup that CISI has, which means that the rest of us get it 6 times.
Yeah, no, very, very valid points. And I think, it is important to note that, I mean, when I was making the difference between sort of a corporate persona and a personal persona, I probably wasn't quite clear enough in the sense that if you're actually the person responsible for the company's account as opposed to an individual. But what you're saying about your general online behaviour is crucial. You know, people can't afford to make mistakes now, and that's something that we have sort of really learnt in the last few years, and what is why there are reputation management companies out there, why the PR industry is growing so rapidly. You know, it's because we're in this environment where everything's being monitored all the time. So you almost have to, and cynics will say, well, it's removing the personality of people to a certain extent, and it is, because you've got to, pause before you actually say something, you actually communicate it if it's going to be going out to the world, as it is on a lot of the social media channels.
Laura, you enthused me about a year ago, so I plunged hundreds of hours into LinkedIn, got my profile up to 100%. And then I sort of sat back exhausted, and then nothing happened. So thinking I've got to do the same with Twitter. My fear is that I'm going to put a lot of time into this and then have to deal with it, and then I'll have to move on to something else, so it'll just sit. That's my fear. But my question is this: is there a resource that we can go to, a sort of bluffer's guide to Twitter? Because this has been fantastic today, but where do I go from here?
I've just heard somebody say there's loads.
There are LinkedIn tutors who specialise for a fee in setting up your Twitter and LinkedIn account, and you pay, but they'll set it up. But what I worry about in the whole thing is when you say content is king, so much of the content is very much unroyal. I mean, it's often a platform for the self-publicist and the egotist just to put themselves out there saying nothing. And what also concerns me is that a lot of the issues that we look at are far more complex than can be condensed into 140 characters and would be dangerous to even try. And for that, I have a LinkedIn profile, I have a Twitter account, and I use them both quite sparingly. What I do use them for is to post to other more discursive pieces, rather than just saying the intellectual equivalent of I'm eating a donut. It's a waste of time.
Yeah, I think that's fair, and I would agree that social media can be a platform for a whole bunch of views, which you wouldn't want to publicise too well. Most people wouldn't want to publicise too widely. The fortunate thing about it is that the internet is a purely democratic medium. So the truly quality content, the stuff that people are genuinely interested in, is the stuff that gets shared the most. The people who are sharing, who are putting up the interesting stuff that people want to know about, by virtue of it being interesting, it gets shared more. So there is that space for really properly quality content to be brought to the top, and the stuff that is purely, and there is a lot of it, I won't argue with that, but is purely self-publicism or like, I mean, anything that is sort of sharing wild views or anything is that usually, fortunately, does sink down because no one's interested in that. I mean, that is the beauty, in a way, of the internet and of social media. Your second point about some issues being too complex to fit into 140 characters is entirely valid. I think I know there's a lot of, especially particularly in financial services, it doesn't work. You can't advise someone. You can't put out financial advice without a whole raft of T&Cs underneath. So, I mean, that simply doesn't work on Twitter, which is why, like I think you went on to say, you've got to provide within that a link to something wider, to something more with a full explanation. So there is that. I think there's that space to do that, basically. But you're right, you do have to be careful. I would agree.
I just want to come back, and because you did mention, where do you go from here? I think that if you haven't used Twitter before, then it's quite fine to take baby steps. And this is probably what I would recommend, is I wouldn't go all out there and think, well, okay, how am I going to be controversial? How am I going to attract attention? How am I going to get, 100 followers in the next 5 minutes? What I'd start off by doing, and maybe this is just a personal approach and because of how I find it quite useful, is just follow your news channels. Sign up to Twitter, have your name if it's a personal account or your company account. Make sure you've got a short bio about it and start following people that are interesting to you. And whether that's your news channels, whether it's the sport updates, whether it's people within the industry that you want to follow, and start learning, getting used to using it, because it's not, it is a new technology for people, and probably a lot of you may in the morning get up and turn the radio on, and that's your instant, way of getting news. Well, if you have your Twitter, and maybe, I don't know, you're walking to a tube, you're waiting for a bus or something, if you're following all of these people, log into it and on your phone and have a look and see what's up, catch up with the breaking news. The FT have got a very strong Twitter account, and they provide all links to their articles through that. The BBC Worldwide service is very good for breaking news. There's also a lot of sport channels out there. Most of the major publications are on Twitter now, and I think it's interesting to be able to easily access all of the different agendas and all of the different coverage in one place where there's only 140 characters, and that's, I think, the way to start. And then as you go through, you may think, you'll see that a journalist will tag somebody who they're maybe talking about in an article. You think, oh, actually, I'm quite interested in that person, I'll follow them. And you start building it up, and as you start following people, they'll become maybe more interested in you. But there's nothing, or maybe not, there's nothing wrong with being a passive user on Twitter, and just using it as an observing tool and a way of getting your news.
Very helpful.
If that's the way forward.
Is this on? Yeah, right. Thanks, Laura. Clive Menzies. I was interested in the reference that Darren made to social media as a democratic space, because my understanding is that, a bit like search engine optimization, these media are very easily manipulated. You can buy Twitter followers by the thousands. And so I think there needs to be a caveat inserted to a lot of this social media, and that is that things are not necessarily always as they seem. In other words, a story that's trending isn't necessarily trending, it may be manipulated to trend. And there are a lot of people working on this stuff because clearly it's powerful. Mm-hmm. It's powerful in the consumer space, it's powerful in the political space, and presumably it's powerful in the commercial space as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think, whilst I think that these technologies are extremely useful and have a value, I think we need to be aware of two fundamental things: that they are all capable of being manipulated, and business at the speed of thought isn't necessarily a good thing, because quiet contemplation and actually taking one's time over decision making actually pays dividends in the end, and reacting instantaneously to anything that happens isn't necessarily always a good thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, especially if you're going through a crisis situation, whilst there is pressure to react if you're open on social media, you're quite right, be very cautious how you react. As we saw with, the British Gas social media incident, think it through before you actually respond in those situations. And I don't know, we haven't really talked about this, but again, a very valid point of the fact that followers can often be manipulated, and followers can be bought to make a brand. It's more a case with a brand more popular than it actually is. I don't know if anyone saw Dispatches about, a couple of months ago. They did quite an interesting piece about this, where marketing agencies were not only buying followers for brands, but they were also paying certain influential people to tweet and actually drive traffic towards certain companies. Yes, that's there, but again, it's nothing new. You know, it's those types of tactics have been around for a while, social media does not avoid them, so it's something to be wary of, I suppose. And yes, I mean, it's not all about how many people are following you. It's about the quality of content and the engagement, and that's really how you can measure the success of it.
Sorry. I'll say something then pass it on. I think from what I've heard, and thank you very much, I think there's quite a lot of really good food for thought there. The area that I'm interested in, I totally agree with the last comment, absolutely. The area that I'm worrying about more is that I think Twitter can be a really good forum for creating good conversation. However, risk is, your reputational risk and what you put out there, and the fact that it does stay actually goes against creating a conversation. So there are two completely opposing drivers there. One reason why I'm a passive user of Twitter, and I use it very much as you said, is to keep my eye out there and see whether it's going to be worth me actually engaging in a conversation. What I was wondering, so that's really just one thing that I'm looking at and trying to find my way through as I begin to use it. And the other question for the Institute is, how are we doing it here? Because, yes, we're creating conversation. Is it conversation because we want to be thought leaders, and is that where we're going? And how do you manage the risk of that with all the conversations that look like we're creating under the Institute?
Well, I suppose I can start from the Institute's perspective and say that essentially managing the risk is an important thing. As you say, I work in a marketing team where most of the collateral and the content and communications we put out have to be signed off by 3 different people before we can put them out. Obviously, no. In most of our collateral, it's that communications is very much one way and has that sort of level of protection against risk built into it. But obviously, that doesn't work in a social media space because you have to be more instant. So you can't. So it is, to some extent, you're increasing risk, sort of, almost inevitably. I mean, in the way we operate it here, anyway, by allowing myself to tweet via the CISI's social media accounts and put those communications out there as CISI. I've essentially become a CISI spokesperson, which does require a certain level of faith. I once heard someone say, essentially, the thing is, you just have to have a reliable person managing it. You have to have a good structure in place behind it, but when it comes down to it, you have to have someone there who you trust, who you know is on point, is on message, and is putting the communications out there that you could almost list before they've even put them out there. You have that strong branded messaging coming through, and essentially what they're saying, there isn't that sort of room for error, if you want. And the final thing that I was once told at a different social media presentation was that, as I've seen companies do, you don't put the intern in charge of the social media account. There is a worry, especially in particular industries, that there's a danger that social media is seen as sort of a low priority. Therefore, the intern sometimes does get lumped with the social media account and says, left to their own devices, you say, all right, you deal with Twitter and Facebook and have fun with it. And I mean, that is sort of a disaster waiting to happen, and it has happened for certain companies, because it has to be seen, like Laura said, as any other communications tool, which requires sort of a thought process behind it, a structure behind it, and a responsible person in charge of it when it's actually being implemented, I think.
Yeah, I certainly think that the intern, like you say, it can be an absolute disaster. But that's not to say when you're looking at rolling out a social media strategy that the people that have grown up with these types of technologies may have something very useful to contribute as well. But it's, as you said, it's the risk, the authority, and the responsibility that then falls with the more senior person.